Hi, Manreet. A very good morning to you. I want to start by saying thank you very much for joining us so early for you, and a very good evening to everyone else. I know that Amrita did a brief introduction of you, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thank you, Sukhi. It's very nice to be here, and good evening to everyone who's joined us. As for myself, as Amrita said, I am a writer now, primarily a novelist. I've written 8 books, but I trained as an engineer and then went to IIM Calcutta. I had a corporate career for almost a decade before I switched to writing. And I have been writing since then, which was at the turn of the millennium when we moved out of India. And I had decided I would take a sabbatical from work because my corporate work had been quite hectic. I had worked with Unilever in India, Booz Allen and Hamilton, and in advertising, and it had involved a lot of travel. So I thought I'll take a break for 6 months. And the 6 months have now officially become 23 years. I hadn't trained in writing at that time. I had no idea I could even write. All my training had been in PowerPoint presentations, I guess. But I think some of the stories that I had grown up with and some of the action in Punjab that I had seen whilst growing up, I felt that there were these things bubbling within me that I needed to find a way to articulate. And that started my journey. And I have been researching partition since I started writing. So it's been almost a quarter of a century journey now.
Wow. So this is a book that's taken this is a trilogy that's taken a long time making, at least in your head. So clearly, it's deep research has gone into it. There are places that we see that the book sort of has taken, the research has taken you. But tell us a little bit more about where the research took you. Tell us about what you found there amongst the people who you talked to. I'm sure there is the historical research and then, people conversations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I have to go back to my hometown for that, because that I think is essentially what made me a writer. I come from a border town, just smack on the border between India and Pakistan. It's called Firozpur. Now, by the laws of India's partition, Firozpur should have gone to Pakistan because it was 60% Muslim majority. But there is much speculation on why that did not happen. When you look at the map closely, Radcliffe's line does a little squiggle and encloses Firozpur within eastern Punjab, which is part of India. And so really the Satluj River is the dividing line between Western and Eastern Punjab, or Pakistan and India as we understand it. When I was therefore growing up, there were a lot of murmurs and conversations and these silences about what had happened during 47. One of my earliest memories is as a child, sort of when you're playing with your friends, stumbling into a room which is full of women and the conversation suddenly hush or they come to a stop. And as I was growing up, I was also aware that every household had a partition story, if not more. But those were not the stories that I was finding in my textbooks, certainly not in my history textbooks. Then, as I entered my adolescence, that was also the time of the Punjab Sikh militancy, which is called the lost decade of Punjab, which is actually more like a decade and a half. So my adolescence coincided with that. And my father was a lawyer, a criminal lawyer. So I would see him our doorbell ringing late at night, these tall, strapping Sikh gentlemen, farmers who had come to seek my father's help. Because at that time we had a law in effect, which was called the TADA, which is the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act. Under the law, literally anybody could be plucked from their home and taken to the jail. And unless a specific petition called the habeas corpus petition, which literally is Latin for show me the body. Unless that petition is filed within 24 hours, you don't get to know the whereabouts of your children, which was always sons, young men. And therefore, they needed a lawyer to be able to go to the specific Thana police station and file that petition to enable the parents to talk to the child. And I don't know how many of the people listening have seen Gulzar Saab's marches, but that film very accurately depicts what was happening in Punjab at that time, which I and my family were willy-nilly a part of because of my father's profession. And very often the men would be taken to the border, asked to run in the direction of Pakistan and shot in the back. And that would be, okay, a terrorist has, in the tally of terrorists or the war against terror, you have another win from the police side. But as I said, I was a student, and like in any other Indian household, we are such an academic hothouse. If you're halfway smart, you're focused on your tests, on your physics and chemistry. And I couldn't wait to get away from my hometown. I went to engineering college in Chandigarh. Then I went to IIM Calcutta. I came to Bombay for the first time to work. And I really thought that I had put my messy town behind me. But as I said, when I moved to Singapore is when those stories, those memories just kept bubbling up. I'd also lost my father recently. And my father was always the person, when he would go away on those calls, he would come back, and however tired he was, he would talk to me. He would tell me stories. And his mantra was that you can ask me any question and I will always tell you what I know. And I felt that I had lost that. I had lost the person whom I could ask questions. So I thought I would write. Maybe that was a way I could, have this conversation on an ongoing basis. And when I started writing a story, which was set around sort of this, the militancy movement, I realized that I didn't understand. I didn't know why it had happened. So I went to the Singapore National Library and I started looking at books, which there are some fabulous books around the 80s and the militancy period. And when I read those, I realized that I had to go back. I had to understand the, sort of the green movement, and before that, and everything sort of kept taking me back to 47, which seemed a pivotal year. And then my husband said that, but you come from Firozpur, talk to the people there, talk to your family. And that's when, we can be so blind to what is around us, because I realized that I had grown up with all of it. And my writing career and my career as a mother sort of ran on parallel lines. And I realized now that I was a mother, what those silences of the women were about. And why, those voices went quiet when I was in the rooms. And we went back to India frequently, sometimes every quarter. And I started speaking with my own family first, with my mother, with my aunts, with my uncles. And initially there was just like, why do you want to bring it up? What is the point? We have buried it all, we moved forward, so on and so forth. But I guess persistence pays, and there are always people who probably are so full of it that they feel they need to share. And I started collecting my own oral testimonies. I started recording statements of the people that I was speaking to. And that was sort of without me realizing what I was doing what a lot of people who have participated in the oral history projects do, which is really just recording testimonies of how people remember things. And at the same time, I had become a staunch attendee at the National Library. I would be there most days, looking up things, trying to understand. So it took me, I started work, the short story that I had begun with, it finally became a novel and was published after 9 years in 2009. It's called The Long Walk Home. And what it does is it looks at the tumultuous 20th century history of Punjab through the life of a family. It obviously is inspired by the life of Firozpur, the citizens of Firozpur, my own father's life. But I was trying to thread through it, history that I had grown up with, but I hadn't seen. And I was trying to tell it through stories because, one, I didn't find those stories, as I said, anywhere. I certainly didn't find anything in my history textbooks. And by that time, I had read Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. And that made me realize what the power of a well-told story could be. So that really started my journey from 2009 of being a published writer. But I think the subject of partition is so vast. There are certainly millions of stories, as we had shared earlier in the poster and in sort of some of the tweets. A lot of people are not aware, but the kafilas that erupted in the wake of partition is considered the largest migration in modern human history. 12 to 15 million people trudging east-west within a span of literally 3 months. And therefore, we can say that there are those 12 to 15 million stories. Where are those stories? We need to talk about them. And each story is different. Each story is individual. Each story belongs to that particular person. And storytelling for me is a way to bear witness to the history that has happened, that is still happening, because it is a part of all of us. And we know now that science shows that it takes at least 3 generations for trauma to get out of a person's body, to leave it. And we are the 3rd generation that is still tussling with 1947.
This is all very goosebumps stuff for everyone who's had, sort of someone in their family who's gone through. And I'm sure that even if you've not, and if you've read a book which talks with the entire disruption of life as people knew it, and the millions of people, it's so tough to imagine, really. Did you also talk to people from Pakistan, people who went from here to Pakistan?
Yeah, well, the advantage of being, I was an NRI at that time, so I was living outside of India, and I was in Singapore, then I moved to Hong Kong, and finally I moved to New York. And as I said, the journey has all been about trying to understand what happened. And for a lot of people, certainly my parents' generation, there was no concept of a West Punjab or a Pakistani Punjab. It was Punjab. When I was growing up, certainly till the age of 10, the transmission from DD Amritsar at that time was not as good as the transmission from Lahore. I grew up on Pakistan TV, PTV, and every 6 or 6:30 p.m. there used to be this ghazal hour, and my parents would both sit down. My father would have come back from work. My mother would be chopping vegetables, and they would sit and listen. And at that time, we know how the alap happens, and I would be playing, and you're sort of traipsing through the living room and out, and I would stop and say, "Oh, he's still on that same thing." And all these things come back to bite us, because I'm now sort of the biggest ghazal fan. And so conversations, for instance, till at least the 71 war, the border between India and Pakistan was open. There used to be trade. There would be these, and because I come from Punjab, we had in the extended family relatives who plied trucks, from Firozpur to Lahore and beyond. And and there were people coming back and forth. And my Taiji, my father's elder brother, he studied in Lahore. He was in the FC college when 1947 happened, and he had to move. And at that time, people used to correspond with letters. So they used to write to each other almost every second day. There would be letters arriving. That gentleman's son, his grandson, their wives, they visited us. But 71 kind of brought a sort of a break to that. The border was, the free flow was stopped. And then, of course, during the Sikh militancy is when the barbed wire came up, because my father, like a lot of Punjabis, hails from an agricultural family. And it was very common when you went to visit the farm that a buffalo has waded across the Satluj River to the other side, and then that farmer is going to send the buffalo, he feeds the buffalo and sends it back. So, and my father used to say that on Basant Panchami, they would fly kites, and he would say, "My kite and my buffalo can go across to Lahore, but I can't." So obviously there were conversations happening with people who were across the border. But as I said, even in my own NRI avatar, I had friends that I spoke to. But especially coming to New York made a lot of difference, because it is, in a sense, sort of the diaspora of the South Asian subcontinent. There are a lot of Punjabis here. I met a lot of people, again, who consider themselves Punjabi, of a certain generation, sarhad, anhad, for them, that concept doesn't exist, that you're beyond the border or within the border. What I also did at the time was because I had all these oral testimonies, I'd done all this research in the libraries, and I was trying to find a way to tell the story of partition, tell it in a way which is, so that when a person picks it up, they don't say, oh gosh, this is so boring, who's going to read it? So tell it in a pacey novel, primarily because that was a time when history was galloping and was outstripping everybody else's expectations and assumptions of what the era was, what tomorrow would bring. So I wanted to tell, and I knew I had to do it in a novel because there are some fabulous narrative nonfiction available, but that was not what I was interested in. I also wanted to sort of take a stab at something which has been done in India. Lapierre and Collins' Freedom at Midnight is kind of regarded as the text on partition, and it is not. It is a white man's story of what happened during 1947. It is a particular lens through which the story is told. But unfortunately, as I consider it, pirated copies of that book are available everywhere. And when I speak with people, when I'm on book tours, that is one book everybody seems to have read, which is great because it is a very well-told narrative. How authentic it is and where it comes from is the place that I question. So I had an idea that I wanted to write a partition trilogy because I knew I wanted to tell the story of Lahore. I also wanted to tell the story of the princely states, which is something we don't talk about. Hyderabad, which is book 2, is a story which has been completely forgotten. And Kashmir is again book 3, which inshallah will release later this year, is a story we think we all know, but I beg to differ. So I was looking for ways to tell this story by being both authentic to the story, also capturing the atmosphere of that time, also capturing not just the trauma of partition, but also the love, the friendships that had been lost. And I got lucky. There is this, Shah Rukh Khan uses this phrase in one of his films where it's something like, when you are waiting for something, the universe finds a way of giving it to you. And sorry?
The kainat will come together.
Yes. Yeah, he's, of course, it's Shah Rukh Khan and he says it wonderfully well. I wish I could just play it. And I came across a professor at City College who does this wonderful course on trauma studies, which is representing trauma in art, literature, and media. And as I said, I had not studied writing as a literary art. So I enrolled in City College in the MFA program. They have a brilliant 5-year, you can do it over 5 years, 8 years, you can take your time. It's otherwise a 2.5-year program. And I enrolled in the professor's course, and I started to learn how to make a sense of all those oral testimonies I had gathered. Because for me, understanding how trauma, I had my own understanding, I had been speaking to people, but really making sense of how trauma works, how memory is not linear, how every retelling refreshes and recreates the memory, how what is most vivid is what is recalled first. How to sift through all that and make sense of those memories was very critical to me. And that is, again, another place where I met classmates, people who came from the subcontinent, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, and others from India. So it's really been an ongoing conversation. I wrote The Radiance of 1,000 Suns, which is a book that, again, looks at two sort of dates in our history. When I say our history, certainly the history of Punjab and the Sikh history, which I shorthand and carry an entire universe with them. And these are called Santali and Churasi, which is 47 and 84. And 84 is, again, some this sort of mammoth event that we never talk about. It is, in fact, not even classified or spoken about or written about in media properly. They call it riots. These are not riots. You could at best call them a pogrom. There are people who prefer to call it a genocide, because a riot presupposes that two people are involved in committing violence on one another. So The Radiance of 1,000 Suns looks at the recurrence of 47 in a sense in 84, because when you study the era, you realize that what happened in 47, the violence, the methods of violence, is a copy paste that happens in 84. And what it tells us is, again, how this trauma, this violence is something we carry in our veins. We have not been able to get past it. And my attempt through storytelling is to say that we haven't been able to do it because we're not talking about it, because we're not sharing our stories. It's something we need to do over and over, because the only way is to let the genie out of the box. You know, the violence that happens repeatedly against women in India. And statistics show that more than 95% of the violence happens in the domestic sphere, within the house. Where does this come from? Unless we ask these questions and interrogate them, you know, we'll not be able to get away from it. So yes, you know, a lot of conversations, and as I said, these are ongoing, because my novels in one format or the other have always dealt with both 47 and 84. This set of 3 books is the Partition Trilogy, and it deals with 1947. Lahore Book 1 looks at the 9 months leading up to the independence of partition of India. So really the narrative starts with Mountbatten coming to India as the last viceroy. And then in the 15 months after is Hyderabad and Kashmir. Now these 2 are happening at the same time. So our leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dicky Mountbatten, who stays on as the Governor General of India, the first Governor General, they are tussling with both these momentous sort of events at the same time. But for the sake of narrative clarity and purpose, I have them in 2 different books. And what I'm doing with the Partition Trilogy is putting the political leaders who are tussling with all this, and the aadmi and aurat in the particular city, so be it Lahore or Hyderabad or Kashmir, on the same page. Because I want to show how the decisions that are being taken in Delhi, how do they impact the people on the ground? So that is the attempt with the narratives.
This will help me segue in my next question, which is a little bit we hear from you about the people stories. Tell us about the political stories of the time, how you researched them, and how did that politics, I just label everything politics, how did that come to be? So the past of that, and how did that shape the future? So it's a bit of a longish question.
Okay. So the as we were discussing earlier, history over the last 10 years, we've seen across the world, history is getting weaponized. It's a way that narratives on both broadly what they call the left or right. In India, we don't even have the left or right, but let's say various parties using their own interests are leveraging history to prove a certain point. And I've always been a history buff. So as a writer, for me, this is both interesting and disconcerting. Because when we were growing up, I think there was broad agreement in terms of what history is, which is also false because it is not. But now we have no agreement. So we are in this very gray zone. For me, one thing that I was very clear about when I started researching was that I needed the historical part, whether it's of the aadmi or the political leaders, to be absolutely authentic. And which is why both the oral testimonies and the visits to the libraries to record everything that I could lay my hands on. In some senses, I think being outside of India and being able to access records becomes easier, because in India, accessing the archives is not easy. It's a very tough job. Many of them are just randomly, arbitrarily close to you. You cannot access them. But because I was in places like Singapore and Hong Kong, and now the New York Public Library, I'm hugely indebted to all the librarians, who have been able to assist me with primary sources, secondary sources. So for even something like that goes by the shorthand of SWJN, which is the Selected Works of Jawaharlal Nehru, which runs into some 90 volumes. Now, I don't know if I was in India, how I would access them, but Hong Kong Public Library had each one of those. So what I'm trying to say is that because I was outside of India, I could access these archives, which made it easier for me, because a lot of my friends in India, the struggle is just to reach the documents. How do I reach the documents? Here I had access to them. And I started writing these books in 2019. And I remember in the pandemic, when 2020 happened, had just started work on Hyderabad. And typically I go with my laptop to the research library division of New York Public Library and would work there. But then the pandemic strikes, and I was panic stricken because how am I going to write without having access to my research material? And thankfully, the library came to my rescue again, because they had some of people classified as research Marley members, which is basically your research members. And then the books were actually sent home. So these books arrived home and I sat with them and worked. So also because of the current environment in India, every single thing that in my narrative, though it's called historical fiction, every single thing which is in quotes, which is attributed to Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, or Dicky Mountbatten is authentic, it's verified by sources. My books are one of the few historical fiction which actually goes for a legal review. Because as we know in India, somebody can get up in Jhumri Talaya and say, my sentiment was hurt. So we have to be able to show, see, this comes from here. So if your sentiment was hurt, it was hurt maybe 40 years back, and you need to relook your sentiment or whatever. But so yes, everything is authentic, it is verified, it is something which has actually solid attribution for that exists. So that is kind of a constraint as well of working with these characters. However, I have Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dicky Mountbatten as my protagonists. What I mean by that is that when I write, I'm writing from the head of Jawahar and Vallabh and Dicky, because to me, they are my protagonists. So when I speak, I have to speak from within their head. And again, the challenge of something like that is that there is, again, very limited information available on who these leaders really were as people. So when Jawahar gets up in the morning, what is the first thing that he does? He used to do a headstand. Vallabh, what does he love? What is really Maniben's role in his life? We know her as his sort of his daughter and his kind of secretary, but she was his diarist, she was his nurse, his companion, his caretaker. Vallabhbhai was very fond of tea, and she would ration the amount of tea he could drink in a day because he had a weak liver, which came from the years he had spent in jail. So all of these people, if I have to talk about them, they have to be characters. And as I said, I've been engaged with them for close to more than 20 years. So when my daughter was much younger, I would sit with her in the evenings and read stories to her. And I would tell her, she would want to know what I was writing about, who I was thinking about, because she would often catch me, sort of, it is how all parents are familiar with this. We're spending time with our children, but very often we are yearning for some adult conversation. And children can see through that. So she would tell me, you're thinking about this character, aren't you? You're not paying attention to me. And I would tell her stories about Jawahar and Vallabhbhai and Dicky, stories that I had picked up. For instance, Jawaharlal Nehru was very fond of gardening. It's a skill he picked up when he was in the jail. He was, as we know, if you have read his work, he was a great observer of nature, of birds and animals. There was a stray cat which used to visit him in the Nainital jail, and he named her Dando. I have not been able to figure why he called her that, but he talks very affectionately how he would await Dando's arrival. Because a lot of times these men are in their solitary cells. They were allowed outside for exercise and walk for an hour. And then the conversations that he would have with Maulana Azad, for instance, it is all sort of fabulous reading. But all of this is available. It's there in the public domain. I always urge people, to pick up these books, which is one reason why at the end of my books, I have this bibliography, which is very selected and limited bibliography, because I cannot list all the books and papers that I have spent time with. And what I'm trying to really do is take all of this information and make these people come alive, who are otherwise sort of these storied figures that we either see in these framed photographs gathering dust on our walls, or sort of statues here and there, but they were real, they were alive, they had their passions, they had their issues. But I also want to show how Vallabh and Dicky, they are literally, as Bapu said, they are two They are his pair of oxen, and he has tied them to the bulwark of India's independence. And that is the way they worked. They were two different men, entirely different, but everything was discussed and agreed, or even if they disagreed, they would decide whose view mattered and that they would go with. And in all terms, though Vallabhbhai was older, Jawahar was the prime minister, and they would agree with whatever had to be done. It was the prime minister's call at the end of the day. So I hope these books give people an insight, a view into that very dramatic, turbulent time that we lived with, because we have taken it all for granted now, 75 years on.
How did that shape us? How did that entire, emerging out of so many 100 years of belonging to someone else, to taking ownership of our future? How did the partition shape India's today?
Well, I think certainly there are a couple of things. One is that because partition was so violent, people said in common parlance, ki parle aa gayi, which is Punjabi for pralay. They're referring to what has been said in the Mahabharata. Very often when you read the letters of soldiers who are writing from World War II, or you're speaking to people who are fleeing, when you read their narratives or hear their accounts, they would reference the epics about story. Because why are they referencing the epics? Because these are stories that they heard whilst growing up. Ram and Lakshman and Arjun or Sita are not mythical figures. These are stories that they heard of people that they grew up with. And so they would reference that, because the Mahabharata talks about pralay, and they would say parle aagi ji, because the violence, it was something they had never witnessed before. So the violence was on such a scale that the only way for people to survive was to just bury it, to put a lid on it. This was both for the ordinary common citizens, the aadmi and aurat, and also for the leaders. Because what Vallabhbhai Patel and Nehru agreed was that, again, driven by a vision of Sita, because they, just like Ram had rescued Sita, they wanted, and they quoted it in those terms, they had to get their Sitas back, because so many women were kidnapped and transacted in, and some of them were married and became wives with children. But both governments, Pakistan and India, took it upon themselves to bring these women back. Very often these women were wives, they were mothers. And when they were brought back, they had to leave their husband and the children behind. There's this fabulous story by Amrita Pritam, Pinjar, which has this as its narrative. And often these women were not accepted by their families that they were brought back to. So there was untold of violence, which everybody had to get past. There was a new nation that had to be built. Pakistan had very little money. It was literally sort of a bankrupt nation to begin with. So on both sides, there was this great urgency to start building the nation, to start moving forward. And what happened in this is that everybody sort of put a lid on it, and women were just told to seal their lips and not talk about it, because we know this in a patriarchal society where a woman's honor resides, supposedly resides. And so that is one, I feel, since we never really spoke about that, we carry that trauma in our bodies as a polity, as a social, as a society. And that trauma surfaces time and again in what we call communal riots in India. It surfaces in the violence against women, children, even men. We raise young boys with the kind of expectations, with a kind of lack of empathy, which has its roots in the violence of partition, I feel. It also impacts us to this day, because since we didn't honestly talk about the discussions that were happening once we had become independent in terms of incorporating the princely states, the citizens, the residents of those states, the violence that had occurred within India, for instance, in Hyderabad, the violence occurred within India. India went under the guise of a police operation, but used its military to invade the princely state of Hyderabad. And there was that violence that erupted against the Muslim residents, citizens of Hyderabad. This was violence. We acted like the British colonial state with our own people. So I feel because there was no honest discussion around it, Operation Polo, for instance, the papers were classified as secret. And I think they were 91 or 99 is when they were officially open. And then A.G. Nurani in his book shares that entire file. Because when Jawaharlal Nehru heard about the violence that had happened, he sent an investigative committee to investigate what the violence was. And that committee put its stories forward. It said what had happened. But Vallabhbhai Patel, as the Home Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, decided to close the file because, again, we have seen so much violence. How long are we going to talk about it? Therefore, this brings in the issue of what are we complicit in? What are we not talking about? What are the issues that we are allowed to engage in and what are we not? And I think that is also the reason why there is this narrative about how Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru were at loggerheads with each other, which is completely false. There is also this narrative about trying to discredit what Mahatma Gandhi was doing, because on 15th of August 1947, when India got independent and there were these celebrations happening in Delhi, there was one leader who didn't participate in them. He was actually sitting in Calcutta, again, trying to stem a riot. That was Mahatma Gandhi. And so I think what the legacy of partition is both the secrets that we deal with, the stories that we don't tell one another, the pitting of one against the idea, the othering, which is something, if we had shared those stories, if we still had the borders open. And this is something I can tell people after, having grown up in a border area, coming from a family which saw its hometown getting sundered. Because, when you're studying it as a historical text, there's this neutral term, transfer of population. What does it even mean? How do populations get transferred? And we know this, that certainly in Firozpur, we know this happened overnight. The mix of population switched from Muslim majority to non-Muslim majority. How does that happen? My grandfather, my father's father, had this story to tell, and he would tell it to me literally every Sunday, because he lived in what we call the Haveli, the old house, and my parents had built a sort of a modern new construction a little distance away, less than a mile away, and every Sunday we would go for lunch with my grandparents. And I still remember we would eat what in Punjabi called matran wale chawal, which is green peas, pulao, just green peas and cumin seeds in it, and with dahi, homemade curd. And I don't know, I guess I was always had this ear for stories, because I would sit with my grandfather and we would eat from the same thali, the sort of the upturned plate, and he would tell. He had a snow white beard. He would look like what people's conception of Santa Claus is. But if you've grown up in Punjab, a lot of elderly Sikh men have this very twinkling eyes, a long white beard, white turban. He always wore white clothes. And he would tell how when they realized that Firozpur would be in Indian Punjab, at that time, a lot of the land owners and holders were Sikh mostly, but the workers were all Muslim. And so he realized that he had to move all that entire Muslim workers on his field. And these were families, because, typically it's not just the man who's working. The man works, the wife works, the children, sort of are around there. And he had to transfer them all to the safety of across the border to Lahore. And he found an acquaintance in the army. They managed to arrange a truck and pile all of these people with a few paltry belongings in the truck and drive them in the middle of the night, because they were escorted by 2 Jawans and it was a military truck. And they managed to go across the border. So that is the transfer of population that we're talking about. That is how it happened. So I feel that for too long, we have got away with using neutral terms which have been stripped of any kind of relevance and real agency. And I think that is why there is this immense desire in people to know what happened, and why there is also this distrust of historical narratives, because people feel they haven't been told the truth. And to an extent, they haven't, because the truth cannot be limited, right? Cannot be constrained.
I think that is probably one of the gentlest stories of transfer of population.
Yeah.
Many others were so much worse, and many who didn't make it at all. Um, but let's go to Lahore. Tell us a little bit about your favorite part. I mean, I've been reading Lahore, and I would really tell everyone to sort of go through the trilogy. But tell us your favorite, one of your favorite incidents from the book at Lahore. Lahore, as you call it.
Yeah, so in Lahore, I alternate between calling them. So the chapters typically in all the books alternate between Delhi and Lahore, but Lahore I call it Lahore because that's how
Lahore.
we Lahore, how Punjabis speak of Lahore, and it's also my way of saying that you know the people on ground were not consulted when the borders were being drawn. And when I say law, I'm also saying when you don't speak the language, when you don't understand the people, when you haven't been on the ground, how can you take such a momentous decision to bisect that land and say, your home is no more yours? It I have spent countless, as I said, days writing this, but to this day, it still blows my mind. And a lot of people, I'll just add this as a sort of a byway, and then I'll come back to your question. Because a lot of people don't realize that when Jinnah was asking for his Pakistan, which would obviously comprise of Muslim majority areas, there were people who told him, but you already have Muslim majority and you have Muslim leadership, as in the elected leaders or the people who were running the places. You already have your Muslim Pakistan in Punjab, in Bengal, in the northwest frontier, because these were Muslim in Punjab to a slight majority, but these are Muslim majority areas and they were governed by Muslim leaders. So what Pakistan are you talking about? So the idea of Pakistan was developed in UP, in the United Provinces, which is now Uttar Pradesh, in the Gangetic Belt. But where it landed was places like Bengal and Punjab, which had no idea. There were no ghettos. There was no, this is a Muslim locality, or this is a Hindu area, or this is a Punjabi Sikh pind. There was nothing like that. In fact, both these areas benefited tremendously from what we call Punjabiyat, and I don't know what they call it in Bengal, but the intermingling, the way people had always lived together. In Punjab, the name Malik, last name, could stand for a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. It didn't matter. People dressed similarly. Everybody had a headgear. Everybody's God was Rabb. There was no concept of Allah or Ram, Rahim. And obviously they were there. But what I'm saying is, just as you say Lord, God was Rabb. So people tend to forget that the idea was conceived in United Provinces, but it fell. It's sort of it cleaved the flesh in Punjab and Bengal, which had nothing to do with the idea of partition. So my in the writing of Lahore, I really enjoyed also digging out, sort of the women from the interstices, because we know of Edwina Mountbatten. You go on the internet and there is so much of this salacious trolling and absolutely unfounded any kind of reality about Edwina and Jawaharlal Nehru's affairs and whatever. But I was really interested in, Edwina Mountbatten did a lot of work with rehabilitation of refugees. She had worked with the ambulance services during World War II in England, in London. And she was a very driven woman. And because she was a Mem Saab, she could go to the ground and get things done, which would be difficult for let's say, a brown person to be doing. So she commanded a lot of authority and she put it to very good use. And I wanted to focus on that, what she's doing in terms of helping the refugees. And the Viceroy's residence, which is Rashtrapati Bhavan now, had some of the largest, all the grounds were full of tents where the refugees were housed and being taken care of. I wanted to bring Maniben out of the interstices. I wanted to show the very loving relationship between Vallabhbhai Patel and his daughter Maniben. Vallabhbhai, how he knows that he's nearing the end of his life's journey, but he worries about his daughter because Maniben never married, and he knows she didn't because her whole life was devoted to this father. And he encourages her to write a memoir so that when he's gone, people recognize what Mani's contribution to the revolution was. So for me, these were very, very touching. They touched me personally, and I wanted to bring them to the forefront. But I also have to mention two fictional characters, Mehmood and Beliram, who are sort of sworn brothers, because Mehmood, as the name says, is a Muslim and Beliram is a Hindu. But he's a Hindu orphan who Mehmood's father finds and kind of brings to his house, and they're both raised together, and they're coolies at Lahore railway station. And in the end, their sort of brotherhood is sundered, like the brotherhood of Punjab or sisterhood or whatever, but these are men, so was sundered. And for me, they kind of are, they stand in for East and West Punjab. They stand in for how these two sides never get to meet. I don't want to give the story away, but through the character of Beliram, I'm also paying homage to Manto, who has a story which has touched all of us greatly, Toba Tek Singh, and I am paying my homage to him through the character of Beliram. These two, I would say, and I also want to add that so the trilogy has these three narratives, which are standalone narratives, because we're dealing with places which are very different. The constant thread is, of course, the Delhi thread, because Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dicky Mountbatten, the Delhi thread is there. But also there are four characters whom I try and bring back. So there is Mehmood and Beliram, and Mehmood will resurface in Kashmir. I just couldn't get away with them. And I also wanted not to give closure, but to see how life is treating them. And then there is Pammi and Beliram, who are there in Hyderabad. So people ask me, why did you not close the chapter? And I'm like, are you still asking me this question? We haven't been able to close anything about 1947.
Lovely. I think that those who haven't got a copy of this book must pick it up, because these characters really start very early in the book, and you can see how the partition changes their dynamics and their engagement. So just to wind down, just tell us one more time, how do we have 1,000 such books written, and how do we have 1,000 such narratives documented and packaged just the way you have? So share that sort of inspiration with all of us.
Well, actually, I feel that certainly enough has not been written about partition. We have some excellent fiction, non-fiction, but if you look at the scale of the catastrophe, and I know traumas are not meant to be compared or contrasted, but for the purpose of making a point, I live in New York City, which is also the home of the Jewish diaspora, the people who fled the Nazi atrocities. And every year there are multiple books that come out that are still wrestling with that Holocaust. These are fiction, non-fiction, memoirs, poetry, brilliant books. Many of them win awards. And the reason why I'm talking about awards is because awards bring books to the surface. They bring attention to them. Now, if I were to compare with the amount of literature that we have dedicated to partition, it's not even a drop in the ocean of the Jewish diaspora literature. There are millions of stories that need to be told. There are narratives that need to be brought forth. We also need to interrogate our history and our past. Every now and then I will have this WhatsApp forward, which is sent to me. And then in that WhatsApp forward, somebody's recounting somebody's uncle's friend in Lahore, and then people are getting sentimental and teary-eyed, and it just fills me with anger. The past doesn't want you to sentimentalize. The past wants you to interrogate it, to ask questions. Why did things happen the way they happen? And having asked that, how do we ensure it doesn't happen again? Now, in terms of gathering stories and narratives, I think everybody has to do their own part. Read partition literature, ask questions, try to write your own stories, talk to people. Talk to people around you. We live in an age of iPhone and Instagram. Tell their stories, record them. A lot of them are just, so many of them have passed away since I started 23 years back, because that's a generation. It's going, we're losing them. And we need to speak with them. Just record anything that they say. Do not try to construct a narrative out of it. The narrative may come later, it may not. But the moment you start recording, you are creating a historical archive. And I must mention here that the 1947 Partition Archive, which is started by Gunita Singh Bhalla and has thousands of people helping her, is doing a fantastic job with recording oral archives throughout the subcontinent, both in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and largely in India. She is a nuclear physicist based out of California. So I urge you to look it up, 1947 Partition Archive. In fact, she has just returned from India because they are releasing a book. And I think they have like 1,000 stories in those books. They have just released it in India. And I think in Berkeley is where, in California, Berkeley, they're having a launch maybe this Saturday. But if you go on the archive, all their oral stories are submitted there. And that is where you can start submitting stories when you speak to people and collect their narratives. So please do join that initiative, because that is the only one that I know which is trying to bear witness to every single story of every aadmi and aurat and get it recorded. So I would urge you to look it up.
True. Like you said, time is really passing by. 75 years have gone, and a lot of people who have come across on either side is aging, if not gone already. So we really do need to capture these stories. This is really also brings us to what Khaki does, which is to document both tangible and intangible heritage around us. And clearly, this is a deep part of our intangible heritage that leads us into where, which should not be forgotten, which should be sort of a learning ground for all of us. I want to take you through some of course, a lot of people have messaged on the group and, privately saying that they loved what you said here. We also have Hassan from Pakistan who joined in. It's interesting to see this story is for everyone, for people, across any of these borders. Yashpal Mehta says that stories of migrants from Karachi, Multan, and Dera are now archived at the Godrej Library in Vikhroli. And this is a project by students of TIS. A lot of people in Bombay, of course, came from Karachi by ship. So there is an entire set of stories that are sitting there as a part of the partition. There is also Sonali Chatterjee who says that after staying more or less mum for decades, my mother started writing about her partition experience at the age of 80. She said that she just had to get everything out of her system and revive the memories of her lost homeland. PB has a question for you. What kind of research did you do on Kashmir?
The kind of research I have done on all my books. Kashmir is a very sensitive topic in India, because when I was on a book tour and I would say book 3 is Kashmir, and the immediate response would be, that will be interesting. Now, interesting itself is a very interesting word. I don't know what people mean by that. I've done the same research on Kashmir as I have done on Hyderabad and Lahore. This is Kashmir of 1947, not the Kashmir of today. And so my research has included the written narratives which are available in library archives of the Pakistani general. There were 2 men involved who led the Kabailis, which was really with the Pakistani army behind them. So it involves their narratives, which are recorded and available, and talking to some people who have, talking as in their memoirs are available of what they witnessed happening at that time. So it is as rigorous and authentic as it can get. And the manuscript is right now being legally reviewed by the lawyers. So That is all I can add at this point in time. The book should, inshallah, release later this year around Diwali, I think.
Lovely. I hope Yashpal Mehta's question has been clarified. He also asked whether Hyderabad is the Sindh one or the Hyderabad in the south. Uh, I think before we started, Manreet and I were talking about Hyderabad and saying how little is known about the fact that there was a kind of, there was a divide that sort of a partition that went on in Hyderabad. So that, I guess. Amon Welling mentions that there was a similar genocide, similar to the genocide in 1984, happened in our history way back in 1948 too, and that was against the Maharashtrian Brahmin families after the death of Mohandas Gandhi. Unfortunately, nobody discusses it, talks about it, or has stories about it. I guess you have something to say to Amol for that?
Well, then, if Amol is aware of it, then it is he should go out and seek more about it. You can tell the story.
If
right?
nothing
All
else, to record the stories, right?
Yeah,
At least.
absolutely.
A lot of people have also asked us about whether recording will be available. Like Amrita mentioned in the beginning, all these sessions are recorded, and because a lot of people miss these talks or would like to go through them again, they are being uploaded on YouTube by and by. So look out for our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to it, and when you'll get a notification when this particular talk is uploaded. Atma Godra says it's an interesting talk. I come from the border town of Sri Ganganagar, and I relate to so much with what I hear from the elders in the family. Kunjan Trivedi would also like to have a recording. Bhaskar has asked whether these are 3 different books, of course, which they are. Jinx Akerkar says, how your story resonates with me. I am 92 years old. I was born in Hitler's Berlin, and I'm a Holocaust escapee. And thank you for mentioning that tragedy as well. And my daughter has been recording my story. Kunjan compliments you and says it's an amazing and passionate take on what actually happened, and would love to read your books and also to meet with you. Gaurav says there are multiple works on Punjab and Bengal's partition, but nothing about Sindh. Is there something that you can say about that? Or if you plan to work on that?
There is work on Sindh which has been done by a Pakistani writer called Beena Shah, and of course Saz Agarwal in India. You should look up both their works. They are Sindhis themselves, and Beena, of course, lives in Pakistan. Saz, I think, is in Bombay, but yeah, you should check out their work.
Meeta says that does the time trauma takes to process the 3 generations that we talk about, does it delay the interrogation of causes and keep aspects sentimentalized? And can this trauma time be shortened in any way?
Well, the way trauma works is, so as I say, like certainly our parents' generation or people, or for some, your grandparents' generation who lived through it, through the events, we can understand how they can be numbed. There is also guilt, because unlike the Jewish Holocaust, where there was a clear villain and survivors, in the case of partition violence, there is no villain. We are all complicit in the violence that happened. Men turned against men. It didn't matter whether they were Hindu or Muslim or Sikh. So there is also guilt, because it is very likely that somebody in your grandfather's generation from your own family has committed that kind of violence. So it becomes very difficult to talk about it. But I don't think there is any excuses for people who are younger. There is no reason to not engage with that, to not talk about it, to not read, to not try and find out more about where you come from and why you are the way you are, and why your parents are the way you are. And there is no way of shortening trauma. There is a Native American saying, which that, when you have a whip in your hand and you unfurl the whip, the very end, the tail of the whip will hit you. It will catch you, but it'll take its time. There is no way to shorten that time. We all have to go through it. We have to deal with it.
Thank you. Jyoti says that it was a change from, it was a refreshing change from the kind of opinions that we hear these days. Vinita, the names of the books by Manreet are Lahore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir, the three areas of partition that she's been talking about through the session. A lot of people would love to read your books. Gaurav wants to write a similar book about Sindh's story on partition. Sonali says that my grandparents did not discuss partition, and when asked that, they said they were too busy surviving as refugees.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Manreet. If there are no more questions, we can wind down this session here. Thank you again for joining us so early in the morning. I hope that everybody enjoyed this talk. Please go to the YouTube channel and subscribe for the recordings. And thank you very, very much, everyone, for being with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Khaki Lab. And thank you, everyone who joined us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.